Thank you for your cooperation.
Hey, so today we're going to be exploring the complete history of Robocop vs. Terminator. This will include the video games, the comic books, the action figures, and the history of how it all came together. Well, let's start at the beginning. How it's writer Frank Miller, how he became attached to the project. And it's kind of complicated. The first Robocop movie had become a success due to the directing and influence of Paul Verhoeven. His unrelenting depiction of a crime-ridden Detroit full of ultraviolence was apparently enticing to viewers. And let's not also forget the contemporary social satire of the 1980s. This was shown in part by unchecked capitalism, economic decline, gentrification, media influence, and the militarization of the police force. And with Robocop becoming a surprise smash hit, Orion Pictures decided to expand the property into more forms of media and markets. For instance, there was a Robocop television show for kids, an actual dramatic TV show, and even merchandise such as action figures and the Marvel comic books. Of course, there would also be sequels to the first movie, and this is where comic book artist / writer Frank Miller enters the picture. You see, the original scribes for Robocop, Newmere and Miner, had already begun work on the script for the sequel, but Orion had wanted to explore more Robocop media, and that required more talented writers to come aboard. And at the suggestion of Newmere, and with Orion's blessing, he suggested tapping the talents of Frank Miller and another legendary comic writer, Alan Moore. Moore apparently turned down the offer, but Miller did not. And so he was given the task of writing a script for Robocop 3. That's right, he originally started on the third film, but when Newmere and Miner went on a Hollywood writer's strike, they were fired and let go. And Miller was moved up to not only writing the third movie, but the second one as well. Although it didn't come easy for him, because Orion wasn't happy with his original script, and thought that the movie, there's no way they could finance the movie that he had invested time in writing that first draft. So 4 drafts later, with help from Waylon Green, we finally got Robocop 2. Now, Miller's Robocop 2 eventually went on to become a comic book because the Robocop 2 we got in the theaters had major changes to his 4th draft of the script. And sadly, the movie was met with mediocre reviews, but it was still able to retain some of the social satire of the first film. For instance, the smoking PSA and the think of the children villain role played by a minor, politically correct programming, and the military-industrial complex buying uncontrollable weapons of mass destruction. And not only were audiences not too thrilled with the movie, Miller was also not happy about his experience as a writer in Hollywood, stating that he'd rather come back for directing, and compared a writer's script to a fire hydrant with a line of dogs waiting around the block to piss on it. So when a chance came to write a Robocop vs. Terminator comic book, Miller jumped on it because there was only one person that Dark Horse Comics could think of to help in its creation. And Dark Horse Comic Publishing House had already been putting together and putting out Terminator comic books, a company that had a lengthy reputation, some of the best adaptations of film media to comic book form, and they'd also done similar crossover battles like Alien vs. Predator. So it seemed like a match made in heaven. When asked about the project, and this is coming from Comics Interview, Miller stated, "Since the source material for both sides was movies that I really loved, I thought it could be quite an exciting story. The first step for me really was coming up with a way to make the two characters cross that wouldn't be forced, to bring the two mythologies together without simply having a Terminator come back, chase Sarah Connor through Detroit, and run into Robocop. There had to be a connection between the two, and that connection would obviously be the premise of the two characters, artificial intelligence." Very briefly, before I move on to part 2, I must mention the artist Walt Simonson on the book. While he's worked on various projects such as Thor and the X-Men, I think it's more notable to mention his work on Alien. Walt Simon had proven himself in many ways, but most of all, he'd proven that he had the chops to illustrate a franchise into graphic novel form. So it felt right when Walt joined the project. And in Comics Interview, Walt states about the project, "I will say that working with Frank reminds me of working with Archie Goodwin back in the 70s, when we were doing Alien and Manhunter. What you get from a first-class writer is that when you do drawings, in this case, we're working Marvel style, where I draw it from Frank's plot, send it off, and it comes back with a script attached. It's tremendously heartening to be able to do drawings and know they're going to come back with first-class words attached." Marvel style, what Walt is referring to, is when a writer just jots down a summary of the story, a couple key moments, and then lets the artist run free with filling in the blanks in between. A great example of this, and why it's a great thing to do Marvel style overall, is probably where it started, with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. When Stan Lee had told Jack the plot for a Fantastic Four issue about a planet-eating monster known as Galactus coming to Earth, and how the Fantastic Four would battle him, Jack filled in the rest of the story with thinking Galactus would have some sort of herald to go seek out the planets for him to eat, and thus the Silver Surfer was born. So it is kind of a good thing that Walt and Frank had both worked Marvel style on this project. Okay, now we look back at the story of each issue. Oh wait, we have to ask ourselves one valuable question before we start. How did Walt Simonson find the artistic help to draw the characters in the book? Terminators and Robocop are not malleable figures to draw. They're robots. Well, Robocop's an android. Anyway. Well, it turns out that two people close to Walt were able to actually send him models of each property from Japan. And in case you were wondering what those looked like, here's a picture of both. Okay, now we can get into the story and the many facets of it. In the future, the last human has somehow managed to infiltrate Skynet. Her name is Flo. And she gets into the time machine and travels back right before the start of Skynet. It appears as if a man named Alex Murphy is the catalyst as to why it all begins, aka Robocop. And right during that time, Robocop is taking care of crime. But before he can report back to Police HQ, Flo uses a self-made plasma rifle on him, ending his life. Now this is where the story gets a little tricky, because in the future, the Terminators and Skynet sense a sudden shift in the time stream. The future is beginning to change, so before they lose the battle, they decide to send 3 Terminators back into the time stream and kill Flo before she kills Robocop. And once again, the machines are on top and winning the war. As the Terminators of present day ride off in a car, the ones that killed Flo, Robocop takes a shot at them and notices they're not organic beings. And as Flo is bleeding out, Robocop tells her to remain calm and she screams at him, "The whole world died because of you." And that's just the beginning and end of issue 1. And before we continue, I think I should mention also that there's this interesting thing that they did with these comic books. Some people hate them, some people like them. There are actually cut out cardboard characters in each of the issues. Issue number 1 is Robocop, issue number 2 is a Terminator, issue 3 is Flo, and the last one is a gigantic Ed 209. Okay, now on to issue 2. In issue 2, there is one boy left on Earth in the future, and he is killed by the Terminators. They think they've won the war, yet again, that humanity is dead. Going back to the past, Robocop talks to Flo, and she explains to him that he's the reason that Skynet will go active. And Robocop decides to go back to police headquarters and contemplate this, that it really might be his fault that the future comes to an end. And so he does this really cool thing and goes surfing in cyberspace. But while he's there, he contemplates the future and his part in it. Not long after this, the 3 Terminators raid a police armory, and Robocop has to take them down. But of course, the explosion isn't enough to kill them, and they come directly at him. And this is where we finally get into the actual fight of Robocop versus Terminator. Luckily, in Ed 209 he programmed to help protect the police headquarters took out one of the robots. Flo gets the second one, and Robocop narrowly escapes dying by killing the 3rd Terminator.
Thank you for your cooperation.
In issue 3, in the future, the machines have realized full victory, and now they are off conquering planets and other universes, flying out into space, having already conquered Earth. But in the past, after the big battle, Flo decides not to kill Robocop, that he's actually human and on their side. And speaking of humanity, Robocop decides to go visit his gravesite, where Alex Murphy was buried. And there he contemplates the future that could happen if he's connected to Skynet and the future is possible. It is a grim future where he sees human beings being buried alive, and he decides that he doesn't want that future to happen, so he sends himself into a trash compactor and commits suicide. This changes the future, of course, and now the humans have won. Victory. The machines are gone. The dark Armageddon never comes. No Judgment Day. Of course, as this is all happening, as the future is changing, one very last time, the machines send back a boy and a dog Terminator. And now, instead of Robocop contemplating committing suicide and seeing the dark future at his gravesite, the kid and the dog approach him, and it is kind of creepy, but they attack him. The dog specifically turns into this Terminator with tentacles, and it cuts off all of Robocop's limbs until he's only a head. The boy Robocop saying, "We will not kill you, creator. We will make you immortal." And this is when they go to police headquarters and they link Alex Murphy / Robocop up with the internet, and they basically just jumpstart Skynet right then and there, killing everyone else in the process. Flo tries to stop this, of course, but she's killed during the battle. And finally, Judgment Day happens immediately, right then and there. The whole world is ended. Nuclear war, everyone. And with Robocop being hooked up to the internet and Skynet being fully active, he hides away a part of his humanity, the only piece left that separates him from the machines. He hides it away for centuries. For years. Until one day he can build himself a body without the machines finding out, and decides it's time to take the fight back to Skynet. In the future, Robocop springs into action, stopping the battle that would have ended the human resistance. This gives him favor with the humans of the future, and the woman Flo, who in this timeline hasn't been sent back just yet. Skynet devises a plan to send a nuclear missile directly at the resistance and kill them all, including Robocop, in one fell swoop. However, Robocop flies into space and halts the strike, using his jetpacked legs as a redirectional device for the nuke, sending it back at the Terminators in Skynet. On a crash landing back to Earth, Robo is barely alive and tells Flo that he needs to get inside the Terminator factory and begins to build himself not just one body, but an army of Terminator Robocop hybrids that are under his control. Skynet is already on the move during this time to extinguish the last of humanity, for real. When Robocop and the Robocop army surprise attack and lock metal on metal with the evil machines. Flying into the Skynet mainframe while the battle rages outside, Robocop is stopped by a dreamy world where Skynet tries to turn him to their side, using the avatars of Flo and his dead wife. They promise him a world where they can all be happy just like this. He can have everything he ever wanted, but Robocop isn't buying it, as one of his machines outside the mainframe sends a signal to him that the real Flo has taken a hit in battle, and she's wounded. This riles Murphy, as he decides to use his data transfer device on Skynet, telling it to shut up and die. The machines all over the planet explode, and Skynet is finally no more. Having returned to the battlefield, Robocop holds Flo, and as she passes away in his arms, he promises her a better future. To keep that promise, he slips into the time machine, and Robo covers himself in the synthetic flesh that Skynet used on its Terminators, so he doesn't get destroyed. But in the past, he destroys the satellite housing Skynet, finally eradicating all parts of its mechanical DNA. This once again resets the future, where Flo wakes up in a human utopia, where there is no longer war and humans live in a perfect happiness. This also resets the past, of course, and back in Robocop's time, he is seen walking to his OCP vehicle when suddenly he senses danger. But there is none. Nothing. But a feeling of calm and tiredness. The end. So there were two different types of video games that came out for Robocop vs. Terminator. There was the Super Nintendo version, and then there was the Sega version. Both are different in many different facets, and both deliver an experience that isn't exactly like the comic books, but it tries to be close more, I would say, in the Super Nintendo version. And what I mean by that is even on the first level, as you can see there in the background, there's a woman trying to shoot you the whole time, and that ends up being Flo from the story, so she's still trying to kill Robocop just like in the comic book. Whereas in the Sega version, it doesn't have any of that. The Sega version, however, does have really gory blood in it, unlike the Super Nintendo version, which just the enemies explode. So the backgrounds are different in the Sega version. The backgrounds are much more darker and grittier, whereas in the Super Nintendo version, it's a lot more brighter and cartoony, as per how they were marketed in the 1990s. The Super Nintendo version also has a plethora of cutscenes in between levels where it showcases off some of the paneling from the comic books and basically directly takes from it. So again, it's much more closer to the comic book than the Sega version, which just has a cityscape backdrop and text over it in the beginning of the game and the end of the game. There are slight variations as well, whereas in the Sega game, it has voice acting, it says a couple of cool things, and in the Super Nintendo, it just has lighter sounds, whereas the Sega version sounds, again, more grittier and just all around more dark.
Terminator.
And while some of the levels in each game share different aspects on how they want to present the levels to the player, like Skynet looks different in the Sega version compared to the SNES version, generally the levels are pretty much the same. And some of the bosses also are different, but it varies. Some bosses include like Robocop 2 boss from the Sega version, whereas in the SNES version, you get Flo at the end of a level instead of a Terminator and Ed 209 in the Sega version. There are many little subtle variations. And in my opinion, the Sega version just wins this time over the SNES version. Even though the SNES version has like a extra 3D level, it has a level where you fight one of those giant Terminator machines, the Hunter-Killer machines. Even with the variations, I still think the Sega version is better because it's faster. It seems like the action on screen is more zanier, it's more gory. It relates more to the source material in that way for the movies, whereas in the SNES version, you just get more of the comic book cutscenes, which I guess it depends on how you'd feel about them, which one you would choose. But I definitely know that people would probably prefer them over the Game Boy version. A game which tries its best to complement the other games by following the same scenarios through Los Angeles and then into the future and then into future Skynet, where instead of fighting a large Terminator, like in the console versions, you fight a giant brain on a platform, which is kind of bizarre, but at the same time seems to make sense for some reason. Also, the music's not too bad, but it's very much a monotone Game Boy game, and it's just doing what it can to give the player a sense of action and score in something that's clearly very limited in scope. Personally, I don't actually hate the Game Boy game at all, but it is what it is. Ultimately, I think if you're looking for a more modern take on Robocop vs. Terminator, then we have to skip ahead in time to the Mortal Kombat game that features both characters. Now, this was actually just more of a DLC. It wasn't straight up anyone saying, hey, let's get Robocop and let's get Terminator. They just both happen to be in the same game. and that finally gave us a full experience of what it would be like to control and fight as Robocop versus Terminator, and vice versa. The over-the-top fatalities are probably the highlight for me, because you would definitely love to see those in a Mortal Kombat game. Robocop vs. Terminator fits perfectly into that world as DLC characters, much like how Freddy and Jason did in the past as DLC characters, and also the aliens. All the things we love from the 80s coming back yet again. Something I want to mention before we leave the video game space is that a NES version of Robocop vs. Terminator was made by a fan into a fan game. I actually haven't looked up how to download it, but it seems really rad, and apparently it's just sprites changed around based off another video game. But I felt like I should mention it as this is something that is out there, and it does try to capture the glory days of the 8-bit era and Robocop vs. Terminator. NECA went out of its way to put out a bunch of toys related to the canon of the comic books, and they look absolutely gorgeous. I own a couple of them, and I do have to say that if anyone is a Robocop vs. Terminator fan and they did not know about this, you should probably go snatch them up before they get ridiculously priced, if there already are not. But that is basically the complete history of Robocop vs. Terminator. I want to thank everyone for watching, and if I sounded low energy or I just wasn't talking correctly in this video, it's because I was super sick. I had an extremely bad cough and sore throat, and I was trying to get through editing the video anyway. I apologize if it was a little slow or weird cut in weird places, whatever, but I tried my best, and just do me a favor, and if you could, subscribe to the channel, it would help out a lot. Let me know that all my time editing these videos is not wasted, and so on and so forth. Thanks everyone for watching.